Hello YouTube. Today we're going to do a little bit shorter form video. We're not going to talk in as much detail about the function. I'll try not to bore you as much and just go focus on the details of how to get it apart. I will tell you how it works, but not go into the depth I've gone into on some of them. This is the Walther P22, and we're just going to start right up. Take it down is this plastic lever here. It does snap down. It's a little plastic clip that just rides over the edges of the polymer frame at the top, and so once you get it over those edges, sometimes the thumbnail to work it out is helpful. After that, you're going to pull the gun all the way to the back and then lift up, and then it'll slide off the front. Recoil rod and spring, doesn't matter which end the spring goes in. This is a same shape spring in both directions. And I'll set the frame aside for a second and focus on the slide. Now the way this one works, you have an aluminum frame with a steel block with all the actual guts in it. That's to save on the weight so that a 22 still has a chance of cycling the whole thing. To get it apart, you need to take the you don't need to, but it's easiest if you take the extractor off. You definitely have to take the safety out, and then there's a roll pin under here that we'll have to take out as well, and then everything will come out after that. So just drive the roll pin out, and the extractor and its spring come out, and that roll pin there. I don't know why I prefer to take the left side of the safety off. There's a ball bearing embedded into the molded plastic of the safety itself on the underside. Don't try and take that out. It's embedded into the plastic. If you take it out, you really can't put it back in without buying a new piece. At this point, you have to do a little bit of manipulation because you want to drive the safety out, but the firing pin goes through the safety. Now, in this particular situation, the firing pin safety is actually whoops, I put it in the fire position here. Oh, there we go. If nothing is pushing this up, if something is pushing this up, that's the actual safe position. When it's being pushed up, the firing pin is blocked. So when it's down like this, the firing pin can come all the way forward. So what we want to do to take it out is we want to push the firing pin past the safety and then start the safety out the other side of the gun. And then it'll catch itself because the roll pin is holding it in, and then the other side of the safety comes off. You can technically do that from either side. It really makes no difference whatsoever. And then you want to drive out that roll pin, and I think my roll pin punch that's the right size is missing right now, so you're going to see me cheat and use a regular punch, which is a bad thing. Well, maybe this is the right one. Let's see if I can get it started. Yeah, I don't want to push that punch all the way through, or there'll be nothing left. I think this one will still work for me. Line that up with the hole in the hockey puck. This is an Alligator Roll Pin. Basically, it's not the same as a regular roll pin. These teeth can be compressed together a little bit, so as you drive it in, it actually compresses, and when you drive it out, technically it expands a little bit more. It's not like a normal roll pin is technically designed to be a relatively fixed dimension. It's always important to get that right roll pin from Walther. It's an odd metric size, and if you put a regular, there ain't no standard roll pin that'll go through, and there's no normal metric roll pin that's the right width that you get out of a box. Anyway, once that's apart, you need to slide this whole steel block forward, and I just put a screwdriver behind it and give it a good push, and it'll slide forward. Once it's about an inch forward, it'll be able to lift out of the frame. Now all the guts are going to fall out, so hang on to them. Mainly, especially this tiny spring, which is the firing pin safety spring, which actually sits in the firing pin safety like that normally. The firing pin would actually sit in there like that normally, and then move forward like that. if something's pushing that safety up, it's going to catch the firing pin. If it's down, the firing pin can move. So if you take that all apart, the only other piece that is in here is the firing pin spring itself. So it's a very straightforward mechanism. There's not any rocket science going on here. Take it out, it's really easy to clean the whole thing. So you do have to make sure you put this in first before you put the firing pin in. You can't put the firing pin in after. And now for putting it together, the important things to remember are basically the parts of this that are extra wide. So if you look, the top and bottom are even till you get to this small lump on the top, or I guess I should say on the right side, and then this longer lump on the left side. Those line up with this this groove here for the small side, and then it's actually the large one goes down all the way in front of all the grooves. So we're gonna have to set this block in up here and then slide it back. Now the part that you have to be careful on when doing this is the firing pin safety spring. You don't want it to fold over and bend. So you want to make sure that it's sitting in there as deep as it'll go. And then when you do this, you got to guide this up and get it all the way up and flush, and then push it to the back, and it'll engage with a little bit of pressure. Pop it all the way to the back. Once it's in there, before you go any further, make sure that that spring is still springing, so you know it's still upright. And at that point, you can put your roll pin back in. You want to make sure that roll pin is fairly flush in both sides. If it's sticking out one side, it'll interfere with the safety as you go back and forth. Safety itself goes in kind of the same way we took it out, which is you're going to push it in from one side while you use something else to push the firing pin out of the way. And then once the safety is past the firing pin, just hold it in place and slide it the rest of the way in. After that's done, the other side of the safety goes back on, screw it back together. And the tension on the safety is just determined by how tight those screws are on either side, so you can kind of adjust it if it's too snug. And now to get the extractor back in, I like to start this pin, get it most of the way in, and then use a punch to just kind of level it out so that it's not actually intruding into the path of the extractor. Drop our spring in, drop our extractor in, and just kind of gently tap that guy back into place. And I'm not quite lined up. Once it's actually lined up with the hole, we drive that in just past flush. Don't go past the lower edge of that hole. It'll stick out a little bit down here, but if it sticks out too far, it'll interfere with the frame and tear things up. So as simple as that is for a slide, the frame makes up for it and how kind of hairy complicated it is. But don't let that worry you. It's really only hard the first couple times. There are two roll pins holding a metal frame inside of the polymer frame. The longer roll pin is the front one, and then there's a slight shorter one in back here. Yeah, I'm going to drop the hammer while I have it in there. Okay, so like I said, it's only slightly shorter in the back, but that's a good thing to remember because we're going to get to a couple screws in a second here that follow the same pattern. Now before you just pull this out of the gun, remember the slide lock here, there's nothing holding that to the metal frame. It is simply pinched between the polymer and the metal on the inside. So when you start to work the metal out of the polymer, as soon as this is visible and you can get a thumb over it, do so to hang on to it, and then work it off the plastic frame. So at this point you want to hang on to this because there is a tiny spring, and when I say tiny I mean width-wise. This is the piece, and there you go, that's the spring. That's not much thicker than a hair, and if you bend it up or lose it, it's really hard to find, and it's just a sucky piece to lose. And so the whole mechanism is just, it sits in this little tiny oval groove, and the spring is just so thin that it actually fits in there, and that's actually how it's supposed to ride. And so when you're putting it back together, you just put a thumb on that, line up the hole that it goes through, and then work it over to the pin in the frame. And as long as you're holding it together, you know, you can see it doing its thing. But literally when you go to take it apart, you know, that's it. It just falls off. So keep that in mind. Hang on to it. There are 2 screws on the back. One Dremel to screw into this one. They must have stripped it out originally. I haven't bought a replacement yet. This thing was in pretty bad shape. The rear screw is going to be shorter than the front screw. The front screw is a Phillips head, and actually they're both supposed to be Phillips heads. My back one is only not because it was fixed, quote unquote, with a Dremel tool. Alright, so this screw is longer than the other one, so side by side. Again, the front one's long, rear one's short. So now you've got 2 shells. Now I prefer to think of the left side of the gun as the top, so to speak. The part that, you know, with the right side down, all the parts can stay where they're supposed to be, as long as you keep them against the right side, and the left side can pretty much just come off. That's just clamshelling all the parts together. The important things to watch out for are the actual hammer spring. It's only leaning on this right side. So once the clamshell is apart, if that's moved too far over, it'll snap and send parts flying. So, you know, make sure that that's where you want it. Let the hammer come all the way forward. If you're wondering how you can do that, now don't try and manipulate the hammer without holding it tightly closed. But the sear system is also the firing pin safety operating system. So this little bump here will actually, if you push that, that will actually pull the sear off. So if you relieve the hammer pressure a little bit, push that down, you can guide the hammer forward. I wouldn't try and just snap it off with my finger because you're likely to get pinched, and you're also going to drop the hammer right onto the sear, which isn't super healthy for it. I'm going to push the trigger pin out only part way. I really want it to still hold on to the trigger if we can. It's not crucial that it does, it's just we don't want it in the side of the clamshell that we're trying to take off. And as we try and start to spread these, we want to try and keep all the parts on that left side if possible. So as I said, the right side, there's no parts in that. This little steel pin in back here, this is part of the trigger bar runs into this to drop it off of the hammer strut during the double action pull. And so in order for this steel piece not to gouge holes in the aluminum frame, they put steel inserts on either side that also control the angle at which it drops down. So that's what that little bar is. Don't try and take it out. You don't want to do that. So here's the whole working bits, and because of the tensions and the fact that it's hard to model what this does with it only in one half. A couple things: the ejector just lifts off those 2 pins, so it probably is already fallen off on you if you're like most people. Not a big deal. But if we want to look at how this gun works real quick, the easiest thing to do first is to actually take the hammer and trigger off and get rid of the hammer spring so you can demonstrate it without that spring pressure. So one of the things you can do is just pop the spring so that so it's not got any pressure on it, and then if you wiggle the hammer pin out, it should come out without too much challenge. All right, there we go. And the spring itself can be pulled out, and I'm going to put the hammer pin right back in. And I am pushing down on the sear while I do that, so the sear isn't pushing it. And I put it into the half cock notch just for demonstrating. If I leave it all the way forward, it gives you a false sense of how it functions. It actually will malfunction, because normally the slide is going to stop the hammer from ever coming that far forward. The hammer never gets further than this far forward without running into the slide. So it's only when it's disassembled that it can actually do this. So I'm just going to use the half cock notch as a reference for where things sit. The other part that makes this tricky is that this big hammer strut, which is attached by that pin to the hammer, has these little ears, and what's hard to simulate is that this hammer strut really functions because it drags along the bottom of the gun. And the problem is that the bottom is on the other side of the clamshell right now. That little wear mark, that's where that normally drags. And the reason that creates problems in doing this simulation is because when we pull the trigger, the first thing it's going to want to do is dip down, and it can't normally do that. It can't go down. Down is it's on the floor normally, dragging right along there, but with that floor missing, it's got a space into which it can go down, which gives you a false sense of what's actually happening. I'm going to use my thumbnail to try and create an artificial floor, and now you can see that what actually happens is the trigger bar pushes that, and it causes the hammer to cock. So as the hammer is going further and further back, it's going to eventually, the trigger bar is going to run into that diagonal bar that we talked about that's embedded into the frame here, and that's going to cause it to start to slide downward, which means it's going to disengage from this piece. This piece can't go down because it's riding the floor. It's caught on just this little mouth cut into it. So as soon as this trigger drops down a little bit, the hammer strut won't be attached to it anymore, which means the only thing pushing the hammer back, the trigger bar, is going to get disconnected essentially, and the hammer is going to fall. So as we're doing this, it's going to reach right around there and drop off. You can feel it drop off, and at the same time it drops off, it's going to pick up the sear, and that's going to be just a little bit before it would actually reach the single action notch, and at that point the hammer can then come and fire and not run into the sear and all that good stuff. Now the actual double action is simply back here. At this point, the hammer strut's not involved at all because we're already cocked back far enough that we're past engagement with that hammer almost completely. We're not even bumping into it. We just come straight in and engage the sear, and this is a little sloppy, so it looks like it's engaging too soon, but essentially the sear begins to lift up, and once the sear is clear, then the hammer can fall. So let's take a look at what that trigger bar looks like out of the gun, so you can see how some of these parts get along. So it's this middle piece that actually engages with the hammer strut, and it's the sides on the left and right that ride down that slope to get the disconnect, or not the disconnect, but the actual drop for coming off of the hammer strut. So essentially, this is your sear for the single action, and this is, for the double action, and this is your sear for the single action. In terms of interacting with the single action sear, it's the vertical bars on the back. They're what bump into the bottom of the sear and lift it up to get the single action stroke. So this is a sear surface. These are the sides so that it can disengage this sear. And then there's these two to engage the other sear. And these big wonder wings on the side are actually part of the disconnect. When the frame goes to disconnect, the way that the disconnect is it simply pushes the trigger bar down. When the trigger bar is pushed artificially down to the bottom, it can't engage in any of that stuff. So that's how this thing gets its disconnect. So with the hammer pin out, whoops, I just launched this here. I'll get to this here and describe it better. Now you can see how that works here. That notch there is what gets picked up by the trigger moving backwards. So it engages right in there and cocks the hammer back, and then as these slide down, as the sides of it slide down those slopes, that pushes it off, at which point nothing's holding it and it fires. The sear and sear spring, if yours is popped off and you haven't noticed which way it sat on the pin, then you're going to be a little bit unhappy. So let me talk about how to get this all together. These pins all have a slightly beveled end and then just a regular rounded end. I keep the rounded end in the side that I'm building against and use the beveled end to make it easier to line up the other side. So the spring here is not actually uniform. There's a long leg and there's a short leg, but they're really close. So in this case, the vertical leg is the slightly longer one, and the one that's horizontal is a slightly shorter one. And if this is the normal orientation of the sear in the gun, but when there's nothing holding it back on the hammer side, it's going to flip to this vertical position on you. But the important thing to remember is that if it's in this vertical position, the short leg is the one that goes towards the top of the sear. So if we're going to put it together like this with the sear, whoops, sorry about that. If we're going to put it together like this with the sear facing straight up and down so that we don't have to bend any springs while we're doing it, then this is the orientation, like a capital L with the long side vertical and the short side horizontal. And where it's going to sit in here is right in this notch, and the short leg does actually poke out of that area. It doesn't go under this, it goes over it and sticks out. So as this pin goes through, we want it to pick up our spring, and so that's how it sits in there. And in that orientation is how it's easiest to put it in there in the gun as well. And once the sear is pushed all the way to the right side, this little Loch Ness Monster head side part can go into that slot in the gun. And in action, when you look at this spring, it's kind of hard to tell that there's a long side and a short side. They really are kind of close to the same height when they sit up there, but the side that leans against the frame is actually the slightly longer one. So like I said, when you take the tension off, it's going to want to sit like that, so you can pop it on and off. You can't get it off if it's like this because it's, locked into the frame by its head. So that's the way to deal with that piece, to get it on and off. The hammer strut, you've got to get it in there and then worry about the spring and the hammer pin afterwards. So you can actually get these guys started with it out of the gun, but you got to be a little bit careful getting it in there. So we don't have to worry about the strut yet. The tail, the short end does stick out the back. It doesn't go any other weird way. It does stick, the short end just sticks right out the back. So what you want to do, putting it together, get the hammer pin so it's basically flush with that side, because we want to come in, whoops, or just drop it. Let's try that again. So we're going to come in here and we're going to get the hammer and the spring on the inside. That way the spring isn't producing any tension. And the key is to get the hammer the hammer strut inside the legs of the safety, excuse me, the sear, and then line it up and get the hammer pin in. Okay, so now it's very easy to get as long as you're holding these pieces together, it's pretty easy to get this hammer strut or hammer spring popped onto the back of the frame there. And now you're working under some tension. Again, I think the easiest place to work with it is in that half cock notch, but make sure the pins are in good, because There, you know, we're putting a lot of wibbly wobbly pressure on them right now. This piece in, you really just got to hook this under the leg of the hammer strut, and don't worry about where the trigger goes right away. Once it's hooked under there, then you can bend the trigger up. And again, this has a perfectly rounded end and a slightly beveled end. So that one's perfectly round. This one has an ever so slight bevel to it. And I like to keep the bevel on the top side just for assembly. And again, not again, no, nothing. All right. So I'm going to leave this one flush and not have to worry about it when we're clamshelling it together. We'll be able to slide that in after the fact. When I am clamshelling it together, besides the areas of the frame that just go inside the other ones, these pins will all, not these two, sorry, these two just where the ejector sits. But this pin and this pin do have to go into their corresponding holes. That's really what you're lining up when you put this together. So as long as all these are solidly in against the left side, it's usually pretty straight. Oh, so while I'm here, let me point out one last thing. My magazine safety is missing, which is why I don't have a black piece of plastic attached to the trigger here and with a spring that goes up into here. And this is where another hair-sized spring goes to hold the locking mechanism in. I don't have those to demonstrate, so that's just, if you've got extra parts, that's what they're all about. The locking one, I'm not even going to try and describe without one here. It's just a nightmare, and I apologize if you've got one. But the hammer, the magazine safety is not really so bad. Basically, you're going to get it all in there without its spring, but once you get to this point, you got to get that spring started and halfway in. So there's half the spring covering there, which should be just enough to get it to stay there long enough for you to get the other side in. But then it's going to be cattywampus in there. So once you get the back side started and you start to get it aligned, you're going to end up having to come around here and with something thin push down on that spring to get it to get out of the way long enough for you to put it together. So again, hard to demonstrate perfectly. Actually, now that I've got it to this position, I'm going to let that hammer come all the way forward for assembly. I think that's the easier position to assemble in. And I keep knocking my ejector off. Sometimes I'll put a dab of grease on the far side of the ejector. It's not like a moving part that I'm greasing. I'm just using it as glue. Once you snap the two sides together, you should be able to get the trigger pin to go the rest of the way in. I've moved it back to the half-cock notch again. And so put our screws back in. Once the screws are in, you don't kind of have to hold on to it for dear life anymore. The one thing I didn't do is take off the barrel. If you, they're all shipped with a small barrel wrench, which is the exact right width and thickness to be able to go into these grooves. To take off this cap, it's a thread protector essentially. Once you unscrew the cap, this comes, this shield comes off, and the whole barrel just slides out the back. There's no real reason to do that unless you're doing something interesting, mounting a suppressor on it. You don't really need to do it for cleaning. I guess if you're replacing the barrel, or if you just have some burning desire to hold the barrel in your hand. Otherwise, I just leave mine all tightened up. Now that we're through, push that side in flush so this one sticks out a little bit on the trigger pin, because again, that's what our slide stop rides on. Take that pin, the flat, the straight leg goes to the top, the end with the small 90-degree turn, goes to the side. That 90-degree turn goes through the tiny hole. And then the whole thing slides into place over the pin. And again, you know, hang on to that and make sure it's got spring tension, but hang on to it while you slide it back into the frame. And the small roll pin in the back, the large roll pin in the front. Obviously this one's had enough takedowns and putbacks so that I can do that with my thumb. And to put the frame back together, I recommend cocking it first, or it'll get the hammer will get in the way. Walther also ships these with a small plastic rod. That's to keep you from kinking your spring. The way they designed this spring sticks out way too far. That's a full 1.5 inches past the end of it. If you just try and push this on, that spring is going to kink and bend, and you're going to end up with a mess. You might get lucky and get it straight on. What I like to do is take a decent sized punch, stick it through the hole in the frame, or excuse me, in the slide, and just use that to guide that spring. Oops, not like that. So I've got it set in the hole in the frame. I'm going to slide it over that and just use that to keep things straight. As I bring this over, it's going to keep me from kinking the spring till the slide gets onto that part of it. Make sure that the lock is unlocked for this, and again, all the way to the back is where it can actually come over the rails. When it's all the way back, you will have to push it down just a little bit because you're pushing against the hammer, and then it'll lock onto the slide or the rails. And then once that's back up, can't quite get it off anymore. That's the idea. So slide lock works. Spring is engaged. Single action, double action. In the safe position, we should see a little bit of daylight between the firing pin and the hammer. That's because when the safety's disengaged, there's a flat ledge which should, you know, aligns with the back of the gun, so the firing pin protrudes out and can be hit. When you turn it on, you've rotated the curved barrel of the body of the safety into the way. So when this hammer drops, it's not actually reaching the firing pin. It's going to bottom out on that curved edge, and you can see that it didn't quite make it all the way. If it made it all the way, it would have made it that far. But the safety actually is preventing the hammer from physically being able to reach the firing pin. So double action, single action, disconnect. It's got it all. So that's the Walther P22 with the safety and the lock removed anyway. Again, those tend to be the hardest pieces to deal with in reassembly, so I apologize. Couldn't demonstrate at least the magazine safety part of it. The lock, I don't know. The lock I found fairly difficult to use from the get-go. There's models that don't have it at all. I think Walther just realized it wasn't the greatest idea, and they only sell it in states where that's, you know, where there's a lot of laws about guns having to be sold with a lock. Anyway, that's the Walther P22. Hope you had fun. Stay safe.